meeting, we take public comment. From the huge crowd in the back of the room, I see there's no public comment, so we'll move on from that. Item number 4 is the 2013 stock assessment update, which is an action item, and we're going to have a presentation on the stock assessment report from Penny Howell. Penny?
Thank you. I'm actually presenting the work that was done by John Swetka and his team of people. And I'm going to run through the an update of the landings first, and then the assessment follows that, and I'll try to be fairly brief. As you can see, the fishery has a long history of being a very small fishery of less than 1 million pounds and $100,000, and a shorter history of being a much larger fishery, peaking at 7 million pounds and $2 million. But you can notice that since 2005, the dollars have increased faster than the pounds, with the price per pound nearly doubling from 2005 to 2012, and that's something just to keep in mind as we proceed. Fishery also has a fairly brief regulatory history. Before 1998, the FMP, when the FMP was approved, the harvest in most states was unregulated. Addendum 1 reduced the harvest from the reference period landings by 25%, followed by Addendum 2 and 3, which also reduced harvest quotas, implemented seasonal bait closures, followed by Addendum 4, which further limited bait harvest in New Jersey and Delaware, and delayed harvest in Maryland and Virginia. 5 and 6 merely extended those provisions, followed by Addendum 7 last spring that implemented the Adaptive Resource Management, otherwise known as ARM, framework for fisheries in Delaware Bay. All of these, the point of this is just to show that all of these restrictions have kept the landings of the bait fishery to a modest and fairly steady level. Based on tagging studies and harvest patterns for regional, well, they're not stocks per se, but the 4 regional populations have been recognized historically and currently. The largest is from Delaware Bay, which includes New Jersey through Virginia. This graph just shows 2000 through 2012 because that's the years when all of the states had reporting programs in place. The next largest one is region is called New York, which actually is New York plus Connecticut, followed by New England, which is Rhode Island and the states further north, and the smallest, of course, is in the southeast. But collectively, you can see that all of them have fallen well below the Addendum 4 quota maximum. Just briefly, this is kind of a messy slide, but the size trends from the fishery-dependent data sources, such as they are, show basically a steady size range being taken by the commercial bait fishery, with the exception of Georgia and Maryland, which is the sizes have dropped over a few years. We think that's probably because of an influx of younger, smaller animals rather than a loss of the larger ones. Now to move on from the bait fishery to the biomedical use, harvest. You can see that from 1998, this is the exact same graph that I just showed you without the addenda added, but as the bait fishery has come down off a peak and stabilized, the biomedical fishery has substantially increased over the last few years. We only have data that go back to well, reliable data that goes back to 2004. Prior to that, the thought is that the fishery, if you want to call it a fishery, the harvest, biomedical use, was much lower. So you can see that this is an upward trajectory. The biomedical use has doubled since 2004, now nearly equaling in terms of the number of crabs that they use to the bait harvest. And the concern here is that as the biomedical has increased from 10 or 15% to 35% of the total in 2004, all the way up to 50, 52, and 49% in the last few years, that this fishery is not really addressed in the FMP for many very good reasons, but something that I think that all of you in this room need to be aware of, that the only thing in the FMP, the only reference to the biomedical harvest is, quote, if the horseshoe crab mortality associated with collecting, shipping, handling, or using the biomedical industry exceeds 57,500 horseshoe crabs per year, the Commission would reevaluate potential restrictions on horseshoe crab harvest by the biomedical industry. Now, I'm sure that nobody in this room is comfortable with that statement, but you should be aware that we've exceeded their 57,000 cap starting in 2007 and exceeding up to 2012, where it's 39% over its supposed mortality cap. Just to digress for a minute, mortality is determined by what the biomedical industry reports as dead horseshoe crabs when they arrive at their facilities, plus those that are bled are assigned a 15% mortality based on a very nice study that Steve Doctor from Maryland did, where they tagged bled animals and saw what their at least short-term mortality was. So it's across the board 15% mortality plus what they actually see as dead on arrival, and that's how those numbers are generated. Moving on to the assessment, surplus production and catch survey models were not conducted as was done in 2009. This time, the update needed to use, we felt we needed to use the same data sets as the 2009 benchmark because this is just an update. And in 2009, the biomedical harvest was not included because it was a bit problematic, and it was felt that it was small enough at the time. But we feel now that this mortality source is increasing, and an update would be inaccurate without it. We also are running into confidentiality issues that prevent presentation of the biomedical harvest regionally, and we feel that we need to do a regional assessment in order to really get at what the status of this population is. So what we did do, that's what we didn't do. What we did do was analysis of fishery independent survey trends using the autoregressive integrated moving average, abbreviated to the ARIMA model. Fits were made to abundance estimates for each survey, and I'll show you the surveys in a minute, over their entire time series, so it's essentially a smoothing. Smooth is the large variants that are within many of the surveys due to changes in seasonal catchability methodology, because most of these surveys are not designed to target horseshoe crabs. So briefly, we looked at 42 surveys. 10 of them were in the New England area from New Hampshire to Rhode Island. Note that the range in years of those surveys is relatively long, the longest being the Rhode Island GSO URI study that started in 1959. The New York region, which includes Connecticut and New York, had 6 surveys. The Delaware Bay area from New Jersey to Virginia, plus the NEMAP and offshore areas, had 21. And then the Southeast came in with 5, from North Carolina to Florida, plus the CMAP. And those were relatively short duration, the longest one starting in 1993. There was a 2-tiered assessment approach for comparison to 2 different reference points. The first step was to estimate the probability that the terminal index for a given survey was less than the reference point. And then the second step was to estimate the statistical level of confidence of that probability, that the probability was less than the reference point, so that we could account for the uncertainty both in the index value and the reference points, because the reference points are somewhat arbitrary. So the procedure was to estimate the probability that either the 2011 or 2012 index was less than the reference point at an 80% confidence level. And those surveys with probabilities greater than 50%, in other words, likely, and with normally distributed residuals, were used to compare the reference points. So those two steps knocked out some of those 42 surveys. Some of those didn't make the cut. The two reference points that were used for comparison was a Q25. In other words, figured out what the lowest quartile was for the given time series of fitted index values, and the question is, was the 2011 or 2012 index in the lowest quartile? And the second reference point was the 1998 fitted index value for that particular survey, because 1998 was the year where the first year that harvest restrictions were implemented. So, the results were that you can see the left column shows the probability that an index is less than its own 1998 index, and the right-hand column shows that the terminal index was less than its own, or was in its own lowest quartile. And you can see in New England, thank you, that 5 out of 6 of the New England surveys that made the statistical cut were below their own 1998 index, and 6 out of 7 were in their lowest quartile. In the New York region, 3 out of 5 were below 98, and 1 out of 5 were in the lowest quartile, so they're doing a little better. And then in Delaware Bay, 4 out of 11 were below 98, and 2 out of 6 were in their own lowest quartile. To the southeast, none were below the 98 or in the lowest quartile. So for coast-wide, the total is about half of the surveys that were considered statistically valid were below their 1998 level, and 9 out of 33, or a little less than a third, were in their lowest quartile. But the large majority of those showing declines are all in the New England area. Now, just for comparison, the current update, I've just kind of shrunk down to the exact same numbers, and now I'm comparing it to the same surveys as they were done in 2009, just to see how we've progressed or not since 2009. And you can see that New England has deteriorated a bit. 2 out of 3 we're now down to 5 out of 6, and 2 out of 5 we're now down to 6 out of 7. New York is mostly stabilized, hasn't changed a lot, and Delaware has, you could say, a bit increased. It looks like they're increased in a sense that fewer are below their 98 index and in the lowest quartile, and the southeast is still doing very well. Moving on, so in summary, the stock status is no overfished or overfishing definitions have been adopted, so we don't have that decision to make. The population indices show unique trends among the regional and local populations, which is why we feel it's very important to also segment out the biomedical on a regional basis, because we're seeing positive trends observed in the southeast, relatively stable trends in Delaware Bay, and continued declines evident in the New York and New England regions, especially in New England, Rhode Island, and North. So we feel that the conclusions from the 2009 assessment are still valid, that management regulations and population assessment should be implemented on a regional or localized scale, and monitoring and research should reflect those local differences. And we're again asking for continued precautionary management recommended coastwide to anticipate the effects of redirected harvest from Delaware Bay to outlying populations, especially in New England. The assessment status, the catch survey model will be continued to be developed for Delaware Bay. It was not included in this update because of the need to include biomedical harvest that wasn't in the original version. We need to better assess the biomedical harvest regionally, and we need to resolve data confidentiality issues. In a word, the problem is that each biomedical facility is treated as if it were a single fisherman, so you have to follow the rule of three. And that prohibits us from publicizing individual biomedical facilities' catch and use data. We're discussing with them to see whether they would voluntarily allow us to show their numbers, but we do not want to do an assessment where we cannot show our work and the mathematics. That would not be a step forward. The ARM framework for Delaware Bay is now implemented and will continue. Comparable assessment tool has not been developed for New York and New England regions where trends in abundance indices continue to suggest mortality is increasing, although we're not sure. We just don't have the assessment tools at our fingertips at the moment. Monitoring and management in the New York and New England region should be given a higher priority to reverse or at least stabilize these abundance trends. That's it. Open to questions.
Thank you, Penny. Great report. We got questions for Penny? Pat Augustine?
Great report, Penny. Thank you very much. The technical committee has done a great job. Raises two questions. The first one is, again, the biomedical industry. And the last slide there before you came up with questions, you indicated there was concern about the confidentiality issues that we've been dealing with, or you're dealing with, to get the data. Yet we look at what their harvest rate has been, and the mortality rate, as you pointed out, it's continued to creep up, and it's up there pretty high. It just seems to me somehow we have to get at that information. We, the board, has allowed and agreed with the need for the product. It raises two other questions. One question is, originally it was suggested that most of that product was being used in the U.S. for medical purposes, and I've been led to believe that that's not the case, and maybe further investigation would point up the fact that a large amount of that product is being sent overseas. Now, if I'm wrong on that, I'd like to be corrected, but that's the impression I've had. You can tell me on that. But what is it the technical committee could do or suggest? Don't need an answer now. I'd like to plant it as a seed. It would suggest that we do to help support you in your efforts to get that data, so we can have a clearer picture.
Somehow we have to be able to use those numbers individually, and we have to get past this confidentiality issue. And I know it's come up with Menhaden and some other things. With any luck, at least the institutions, the companies that are in New England might be more amenable to letting us talk about their numbers in public, and that would solve the first problem. But somehow, if these institutions could not be treated as if they were single fishermen, then it wouldn't be a confidentiality issue. I throw that out as if it was simple, and I know it's not.
Just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to belabor the point, but it just seems to me that the board has agreed to allow this process to go forward and to allow a company or companies to make a considerable profit at the expense of fishermen. And there is another sector that can also use the product. And then there's always a concern about where, in New York's case, as been evidenced by Mr. Gilmore, in the New York area, we have found a tremendous number of our fishermen are transporting those animals out for other purposes because the other states are closed off. So it's kind of a compounding problem. We have product for money, yet they don't want to tell us how, where, and when, and how many. And on the other hand, our product, I'm sorry, our biomass or population of horseshoe crab seems to be, you said stabilized, but it's really going down. There's a conflict here, and maybe the board will have to look at putting a motion on the table that says that the technical committee should be allowed to collectively get that information and present it as a single unit. But I think we have to stay on that subject, and let's not let it drop before the meeting's over, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Pat. Fish and Wildlife Service?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My comments are along the same lines as Mr. Augustine, so I'll be brief. We've allowed the, well, we don't allow them, but the biomedical industry has exceeded the cap for 6 years running. And because of the benefit of their product, human health and safety, we sort of have not reacted to that, and I understand that. But the notion of they have this data, I have staff who have asked a member of the biomedical industry directly, and they flatly denied to waive the Rule of 3 confidentiality issue. So I think we're doing them a good thing. They can do a no-cost contribution to our assessment, greatly add to our assessment worth and value, and we're being denied that. And I know the Stock Assessment Committee and the Technical Committee are sorely frustrated by this. This board, I think, I've been in this horseshoe crab arena for a dozen years now, is to be commended for allowing us to develop this sort of state-of-the-art ARM framework. It is state-of-the-art, and people look up to that. It's a model to be followed. It could be better if we had this regional biomedical harvest data. I don't know what the board can do to apply pressure, or if not, but I'd like to be on record as saying that we are frustrated by it.
Thank you. Dan, do you have a comment?
I had a question actually on the presentation. Could you go back to the historical bait landings 2000 through 2012, the bar chart that showed the regions? And I guess I had a question about the magnitude of the so-called New York bar in 2000. It seemed really high. I'm just curious if that was just an artifact of the data.
The green, it's New York plus Connecticut.
Yeah, the green bar, no,
Yeah.
2000.
I think some of that problem, the 2000 year, was that at that point the data are estimates.
Right.
I know it was in Connecticut, a rough estimate, because we had no reporting in plate. Well, actually, that's not true. It started just in the year 2000. You might want to take that bar with a grain of salt.
Yeah. Okay. You know, back home, we're getting beaten up by some local shellfish farmers who are insisting that we close a certain abatement to horseshoe crab harvest because they claim the horseshoe crabs have benefits for shellfish growing. And, you know, we're trying to determine an appropriate response. The problem is these are such localized populations. We would need an incredible amount of man-hours of human resources to dedicate to all these little meta-populations. You know, we've got one in the eastern side of Cape Cod Bay. We might have one down in Barnstable Harbor. We've got them, you know, on Monomoy, another one on Buzzards Bay, and they all may be completely distinct. So this is an incredible challenge, and I'm not confident about our enforcement activities. I don't know if the enforcement committee has ever been asked to sort of fess up to the amount of enforcement that they do, but I'm concerned that there is inadequate enforcement. I mean, a lot of this harvest happens at night, you know, in remote places, and then I think of the fate of the crabs once they're landed. They're shipped all across state lines. There's no striped bass-like tagging program like we are embarking on now. I could envision 10, 20 years from now our successors creating a tagging program for crabs that are leaving states and coming in and going. So I think there's a lot more we'll probably have to do in the future that we haven't even begun to address.
Thanks, Dan. Robert Boyles?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to remind the board, or make the board aware that regarding biomedical, you know, notwithstanding the issues of confidentiality and data, I think we all understand that and need to find a way to work through that. But comment was made earlier about these are animals that are taken away from the fishermen. At least in South Carolina, the way that fishery is prosecuted is that the biomedical industry contracts with fishermen to go out and harvest. So the fact that they're not available for bait doesn't necessarily mean that participants in that fishery, that the commercial guys, fishermen, are cut out of that resource. It's just a different use of that resource. And another comment, we had a presentation from a representative of the biomedical industry at our advisory committee several years ago, and I'm woefully unprepared to comment on the various uses of it, but basically what this representative indicated to our advisory committee is if you've got something in your body that was manufactured, and as the population ages, there are a lot of us who fall into that or will fall into that category, then you've benefited from the lysate that is derived from the horseshoe crab blood. So it is a different use, but I think we just need to keep in mind that there are, as Mike suggested, there's a terrific public trust benefit associated with those resources. Thank you.
Yeah, good points, Robert. Jack Travelstead? Oh, sorry.
Can I just quickly address that? Yeah, we're not asking to shut the fishery down or anything. We're asking for the data. And a suggestion that the technical committee made, and some of it might be in our ignorance of the idiosyncrasies of the industry, but once the crabs are bled and released, our concern is that they're not really healthy animals, having lost a third of their. And if they could go into the bait fishery after bleeding, this whole problem would go away. Now, I don't know whether the fishermen could live with it that way, but that's a suggestion that we'd like to throw out to the biomedical industry. I'm sure there's logistic issues, but also if bled crabs could be used for bait, then all of a sudden you've collapsed the mortality by almost 50%.
Mr. Travelstead.
Thank you. I'm disturbed by this confidentiality issue and this pushback that we're getting from the biomedical industry. And it seems to me, first I would suggest that the state directors be made aware of where we're getting the pushback from, and maybe there's something we can do to help there. I'd also suggest that we invite the biomedical companies to our next meeting where we might have some dialogue with them around this table, and hopefully explain the importance of their releasing this information for their own benefit. It seems to me we have a little bit of something to, some way to convince them, given that we have these targets that we haven't met in 6 or 7 years. I think we have ways of getting their attention, and we ought to make use of that.
Thank you. Maren has a comment on that.
We've actually, Tony and I have had a conference call with Alan Bergenson, who's at Lonza Chemicals, and we discussed releasing their data. Because their businesses, if their position is if they release the data, then, and I'm certainly not a business-minded person, but if any of the other companies knew how much they harvested, then it could impact their business model and put them at a disadvantage. And maybe Tony wants to elaborate on their position, but that's just what they mentioned to us on the conference call. I just wanted to make you aware.
And Alan has reached out to the other companies to see if there is anything that we can do to get around this issue. And again, it's not that they won't give us the data for the TC to review. They can have it if they have confidential access. It's just the way we want to use it and publish it, it then becomes public. And so we are engaging in a conversation, but we could take it a step further to bring them forward to the board to have them have that conversation with you folks.
Thanks, Tony. Senator Boyle?
Yes, but Sharon, I just have a question. If the biomedical industry says, no way, no how, we're not going to give this information up, what would be a way of fixing that? Would it be congressional legislation on a federal level? Would the commission itself take it up? I mean, how do you resolve that issue?
It's the state and federal confidentiality rules that apply to fisheries in general. and since they're considered a dealer, they fall under that law.
So to fix it, you'd have to amend, when you say state and federal, a congressional act or a state-by-state law change?
Both.
Next, I have Pete Himchek.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little confused here. The biomedical companies under, I believe it was Addendum 3 when we developed the questionnaire, they provide completed, I guess, trip tickets for sampling events, and they account for all the crabs that are collected, transported, rejected at the facility, bled at the facility, and then released. So we know all the records of all the companies, how many crabs they bleed, how many they look at, how many they reject because of size or injury. So, and then all those data are compiled to come up with the estimate that you put on your graph, mortality related to biomedical utilization. So why, I'm having trouble understanding why, for stock assessment purposes, you have to release like South Carolina's numbers for, and then there are like 4 companies basically. Why do you have to release the actual numbers if you're going to do something on a regional basis?
Because the companies divide by region, and we're seeing regional differences in the recovery. So if we're going to run a model that says what's going on in the Southeast versus what's going on in New England, we can't have the biomedical as one big glom. We have to divide it up. And there's only 4 companies, but they fall into less than 3 by region.
Well, so could you not maintain the confidentiality of the data within the stock assessment subcommittee instead of going? You deal with confidential data on other stock assessments.
Yeah.
And why? I mean, why does it in your report on the stock assessment for a region? Could that not be camouflaged somehow in mortality? And not just, give their actual records out.
Yeah, we give you an assessment that says, here's the numbers, believe us, because we can't tell you how we got them.
Part of the problem is, even if you did smush all of the data by region, because the bait records are public, any individual can go and obtain the bait records and then figure out the biomedical records by region.
Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still trying to visualize the smush on a horseshoe crab. Following the senator's lead, in the FMP we have a certain volume that biomedical is allowed to harvest at this point. Is that no? That's not correct. What's the number then?
There's no quota. It's a mortality threshold. It doesn't have to do with the harvest.
Okay, mortality threshold that is set for them to live within. They're going over that, and would we not have the ability to, in the FMP, to, if we allow overages of that, then we require release of information? Would we have some leverage, in that piece?
So in the FMP, it just says if the threshold is exceeded, then the board should consider developing best management practices. And if you'll recall, back in May, we discussed this, and the board was satisfied with those best management practices.
Follow up. So if we revisited that and our best management practices, we decided that we needed that information to, in other words, you can see where I'm going. Is there a way that we can, we have some leverage here to get them at the table and say, let's have the information, and will facilitate what you need.
Yeah, Rich, I was thinking the same. We need a hook, and we seem we have one in the FMP. So you know, we can now start defining what we want from them based upon that, you know, threshold. Because it did, as I remember the data, I mean, they're tenfold increase over what that number was. So I think we really have some leverage. So. I have Steve Myers next.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Having signed confidentiality documents for Horseshoe Crab, both at the federal and the commission level, I think, following up with Mr. Travelstead, Pete, other people, Richie, we need to get these guys in the room for a sit down and discuss this. They're going over limits. Yes, indeed, as Mr. Boyles pointed out, this is a very important element for human health. Let's get everyone together to try and figure out what we're going to do on this. They're going over their quota. It's understood. It's not good. But again, let's get everyone together and trying to resolve this. Thank you.
Just to clarify, they do not have a quota. It's just a threshold that was put in the FMP, and the FMP only indicates that the board should consider it. There's not really any definitive language in the FMP to address this.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps we need to have an addendum that quantifies this a bit more.
Good point. Dan, was it to that point, or okay? Then let me go to Tom McConnell first.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with the direction I think the board's going, but now one comment is we know that the total amount of crabs bled is like 600,000. There's only 4 companies. My previous history, these companies know what the other companies are bleeding. We know with a pretty tight margin. So, you know, I think it's a little bit of a stretch to use the business argument. I really think that we should put a letter together and send it to the biomedical companies with the points that we raised. You're exceeding your threshold. It's leading to increased uncertainty. We are going to have to evaluate it and give them a list of questions and have them come back and present them to us and then determine if we have to take further action or not. The other point is that my understanding is that they have historically and probably still are targeting the larger female crabs. And if that's the case, particularly for the Delaware Bay region, female harvest is prohibited. And if there was the opportunity to allow these female blood crabs to go into the bait market, which I believe they currently can't, that may help also reduce some of the mortality associated with the female crabs being bled. And that may be something that we want to consider for the Delaware Bay region, where one of these companies, one of the bigger companies, is involved in. Thanks.
The blood crabs can go into the bait market, and in Massachusetts, the majority of them already do.
The letter sounds like a good idea, but Bob, would we have to essentially bring that to the policy board again, or what?
Yeah, the timing is going to be tough for that. But, you know, this is a coast-wide board other than Pennsylvania and Maine. So I think, you know, the will of this group is probably reflective of the whole. But just while I'm speaking, you know, I think to Senator Boyle's point earlier about changing laws and doing those sorts of things, you know, like philosophically for me, not the position of the commission, but just me, you know, I think a dialogue on data confidentiality at some point makes a lot of sense. I mean, you know, folks are harvesting public resources. They're, you know, why is that information, you know, so privileged and so, you know, kept in confidence? But that's a bigger picture. But you know, there are all the state laws have. I think all the states have confidentiality laws, and Magnuson-Stevens obviously has, you know, provisions for confidentiality in there. So getting those changed is probably a pretty heavy lift. It's going to take some time.
Thanks, Bob. Dan McTiernan.
Yeah, just to clarify, and Marin mentioned in Massachusetts there are many bait crabs that are bled. So I understand if the business model of a biomedical company is to have a crab be harvested on their behalf, bleed it, and then return it, then yeah, it's a one-for-one. But in Massachusetts, there's no relationship in Massachusetts between the biomedical harvest and the number of bled crabs, because so many of the bay crabs are passing through. So I need to talk to Penny maybe to understand a little more of the nuanced missing data, but I don't quite understand why the biomedical firm's business model gets exposed in this scenario, because there's no relationship.
And just to clarify, if the bled crabs go into the bait market, then they're counted against the bait quota.
Hang on, I'm going to follow the parliamentary rules here because some of you guys talked already. Let's go to Bob Ballou.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Penny, my sense from your presentation is that irrespective of this biomedical confidentiality issue, which is a significant one, and I concur with the sentiments expressed by the board, there are stock concerns in New York and New England, and based on the fishery independent survey results. So what I'm very interested in is the technical committee's recommendation as to how to proceed. Do we need to proceed with regard to more monitoring, perhaps the development of an ARM model approach for assessing the stock in that region first before we consider potential management response, or should we be looking very soon, if not immediately, at a management response based on the survey results, which do appear to be very concerning?
From a technical standpoint, I would like to see the data and a model developed first. I'd have to defer maybe to Mike, who actually worked on this, whether how fast that could be done, or whether what the holes are in order to do a model in the New York, New England region. I don't see this as so urgent that we can't do it in a little more organized way and get an assessment that is on stronger feet, because right now all we have is the indices.
Quick follow-up then. I would just certainly support the moving forward in that direction in the appropriate way, whatever that means. I mean, the message seems to be pretty loud and clear regarding the concerns in New York and New England, and as a New England representative, I would like to make sure we proceed as we should. Thank you.
We go to Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little confused. We're trying to get some information and trying to get over the confidentiality rule. We're trying to get some information from them, and is it on how many crabs they're using? Because on the other hand, you just put up some figures that show that they're over the target. So it looks like you've got some information. So I'm trying to figure out what do we need that we don't have in this scenario.
So as Penny mentioned, the threshold is 57,500 is the mortality threshold, and the TC calculates that threshold by taking what the biomedical companies report to staff and then assuming a 15% mortality on their total harvest. So as the staff person, I do those calculations, and then I put it all together, and you get that 57,000, or the 79,000 is the mortality estimate for the number of crabs that died. So what the TC and the stock assessment subcommittee would like to see is the individual harvest for each biomedical company, or by region. But since there's only one company in each region, it would be the company.
So you're trying to tease out how much from each, but you do have the total, and you just don't know which one's coming from where. Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
That's correct. The TC and the stock assessment subcommittee don't have confidential data access, and then even if they could use it, they couldn't release it to the public.
Thanks, Bill. Dr. Rhodes?
Yes. I just had two questions, and one is I just do not remember how we came up with the initial 57,000 crabs when we came up with this original. I know it came from probably PDT or the SASC.
It was 1% of the total coastwide stock in 1998. It was a de minimis status.
Okay, and currently the biomedical is about, if I'm remembering right, it's about 10% of the total coastwide mortality. So it's about 10% biomedical, 90% bait. Is that?
For 2012, yeah.
Okay. And then one last point, listening to keeping all the bled crabs to use for bait harvest. To me, that would be like taking milk cattle and turning them into beef cattle. You know, at one point, you know, you're getting 85% of those crabs back, and it will be hopefully a renewable resource. Anyway, to that point.
Yeah, that's another research need. We know that the animals are released alive, but we don't know really whether they reproduce. That probably they don't. I'm sure they don't reproduce that year. We don't know whether they reproduce the next year. So just the fact that they're alive, it doesn't really tell you the whole story.
Okay, I have Pat Augustine and then Pete Himchek, and then maybe we'll go for a motion.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following the conversation, it looks like we do have some action we can do. Richie White pointed out the fact that the document does have a mechanism about best management practices. And Aaron, you pointed out that they're over the threshold, they're over their number. And whether you have collectively put together what the discard mortality is or the mortality is, why could we not put a letter together as we bring these 4 companies together, put a letter together to say we are bringing you together primarily to inform you that you exceeded the threshold in X number of years, and therefore the board is considering management action to reduce whatever it is you're doing to bring you more in line with where we should be. And along that line, and let the PDT staff and yourself, Mr. Chairman, develop a letter along those lines. But I think we need a hammer, a big hammer, like a sledgehammer. And really, they're in business like our gentleman from the eel industry yesterday tried to slam dunk a business plan that was different than what was originally presented. The biomedical industry presented, here's what we're trying to do for the betterment of humanity and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Mr. Boyle, I happen to be one of those recipients of that product, many times over, by the way. So I'm not dunning them. What I'm saying is we can't take an action that should be positive and go forward. And I think the sooner we can bring them together, Mr. Chairman, with the understanding that they're kind of gone over that line and we've got to bring them back in the line. And at that point in time, Penny, maybe, just maybe, they'll collectively say, woo, 3 of us from one area and one's in the other area, they're doing all the problem. And we may get that information then. But, Mr. Chairman, I think that's the way we have to go. We have to use a sledgehammer.
Thanks, Pat. Pete?
Yeah, I think the letter approach that Mr. O'Connell suggested is the appropriate vehicle. And in this case, we have a relevant precedent because under an Open Public Records Act, request in New Jersey by environmental groups for the records of Limuli Laboratories on how many crabs they collected and how many they bled. They sued to obtain that information, and the department supported Limuli Laboratories under current statute that's considered them as business records as they would be for a commercial fisherman, and we refused to release those records, and it went up to the state Supreme Court, and we lost. So the records were turned over, and it's a small subsidiary of the bigger company that's in South Carolina, but the environmentalists pushed for the records, and they had to be turned over. So I think a letter with all the facts, with the FMP reference, with the need for the regional data, and the fact that, you know, who's fooling who here? I mean, I think we know who the players are and what they're harvesting, so I think it would twist the arm and get the results.
That's a good point, and the New Jersey case went in the favor of the plaintiff, I guess. But there was also another case in a different state, and I can't think of which state it is off the top of my head, where the records were kept confidential, and the plaintiff did not win. So I just wanted to let the board know.
We've had good discussion on this, and I think this is an action item, so we're going to need a motion to move this forward. So we need a motion to accept the stock assessment update for management use. I have Mr. O'Connell first.
I actually have one more question, if I could ask. In regards to the allowance of lead crabs into the bait market, just want to get some clarification from the board today, if possible. And I just checked with our staff. It's been our understanding that because females are not allowed to be used in the Delaware Bay region, that female blood crabs could not go back into the bait market, and as such, we have not been allowing that. Obviously, if it is allowed, there's some enforcement issues. But if this board agrees that, from what we heard from staff, that that is allowed, that would allow for a pretty significant amount of females from the bleeding companies in the Delaware Bay region to go into the bait market. That would likely put the biomedical companies back below the threshold and help with some of the bait demands from eelers. So just some clarification if we can today, or a follow-up after the meeting.
I will look into that and let the board know.
Roy Miller.
Mr. Chairman, one quick question before we discuss the motion, and that is, how confident are we that this threshold, which was based on the 1998 stock status, is still valid and doesn't need to be updated? Are we okay, Penny, with that threshold?
Well, that's an allocation issue. So I would put that ball back in your court. We're looking at total mortality, how you want to allocate that mortality. It was decided that so much would go one way and so much would go to the fishery. If the board decides that the biomedical should have a higher threshold, then we would have to run the model that way with the mortality allocated differently. We only care about total mortality, except the fact that it might be demographically different.
If I may follow up, that was my fear, that the threshold was derived somewhat arbitrarily, and it may not be indicative, is where I'm going, that we're having a problem with stock status because of this somewhat arbitrary threshold, in which case I wouldn't be confident in holding the biomedical industry to this threshold when perhaps some other number may be more appropriate now. Thank you.
Merritt just pointed out that if they don't want to be regulated, I mean, I'm saying this much more black and white than it actually is, as long as they're in de minimis status, which is the level we gave them, then like any other state, they would have de minimis status and they wouldn't have to comply with the FMP. But as soon as they're over that de minimis status, like every other fishery, they should be complying with the FMP and they should be regulated. So that's, to some extent, that's their decision whether they want to stay on a de minimis status, which I don't think they do. And collectively, the other thing is that the trajectory, I mean, now they're at 79,000, but there's every reason to believe that there's a worldwide demand for this product, so they're going nowhere but up. So they're not in de minimis status, and they're not regulated, so that's the problem.
Mr. Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you ready for a motion? If you wordsmith it for me, I'd like to say after this comment from Mr. McKernan.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Thank you. To the point that I made earlier about the early years, is it possible, before we accept this document, that we do it conditionally, that those numbers could be asterisked or some note could be put in the table that some of those early numbers are, because it says reported. State by state, Atlantic Coast Horseshoe crab landings reported. And if some of those numbers weren't reported and they were just estimates in order to create a quota, is it possible to just put a caveat in the table that for the public's benefit?
In the original SOC assessment document, there are asterisks that say which numbers were actually numbers and which ones were estimates. I didn't put it on the graph, but I
could follow up. I'm looking at the table in the report, and so could it be changed there? Thanks.
Thanks, David. Okay, Pat.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the board accept the stock assessment update for management use with any changes or corrections that were made today.
Do we have a second? Second by Mr. Travelstead. Is there any discussion on the motion? I see none. Is there any objection to the motion? Okay, I see no objection, so we will take that as approved. Just on the, oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm just interested in the issue that I brought up. I mean, now that we've accepted the stock assessment for management use, I'm very interested in moving forward as appropriate in the New York and New England regions. So I'm wondering, and I look to you for guidance on this, would this be an appropriate time to recommend that the TC report back to the board on an issues along the lines of characterizing data collection, monitoring, and assessment work needed to address the population declines in the New York and New England regions? Would this be an appropriate time to make that request to the technical committee?
Yeah, and I think TC can do that. Oh, yeah, Bob will take care of that. The other suggestion was that we craft a letter, I think. So Tony, since you're the ranking commission staff now, oh, here comes Bob. But anyway, so is that something that we can just do just by, is everybody okay with that idea? I don't see any objection to that, so we add that to the list of, things to keep you busy.
And so just to clarify, is the board thinking that we would like to invite the biomedical industry representatives to the next board meeting in February after we have sent that letter to continue these discussions? I'm seeing nodding. Okay, thank you.
That sounds like a great idea. Okay, moving on. Our next agenda item is the Horseshoe Crab Technical Committee report, and Penny's going to do that also.
This will be very brief. There's just 3 topics that the technical board dealt with. The first one was an update on the request to ban Asian horseshoe crab imports. Just to go over our reasoning behind that is we're concerned about imports that come with the frozen horseshoe crabs that aren't really frozen very well, of viruses, plants, animals, and other imports. These Asian species are not assessed or regulated in any way, so it's a real short-term and unsustainable answer to meet the demands here. Delaware, Maryland, and South Carolina have taken action to ban the importation and use of Asian horseshoe crabs. Maryland is Massachusetts is moving forward, but they're still in the process. The other states have not taken action for various reasons, small fishery, lack of authority, and at least in the state where I am, they feel that it should be done on a federal level, so banning this state by state is just not the way to go. Second topic that we dealt with was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife red knot listing proposal, and that's done now. It's been listed as threatened, or a proposed rule to have it listed as threatened. We had a conference call to discuss the concerns and impacts to the states. We recommended writing a comment letter clarifying certain aspects of the management. That letter dealt with some of the issues that we discussed, that the proposed rule expressed concern over the uncertainty of the future availability of horseshoe crabs, and we felt that there really wasn't an uncertainty, that there's a management plan in place and that eggs would be available in the future. That the ARM working group anticipates continued use of the ARM framework, and that was not going to be shouldn't be listed as a concern. and that future use would not jeopardize the model utility. The decline in horseshoe crab abundance is outlined as a factor which contributed to the red knot's decline. However, that was based on historic parallel correlation between the rise in harvesting in the fall of the birds. TC recognizes the horseshoe crab harvest contributed to the overall lower abundance, but the magnitude of this contribution is hard to define given the uncertainty of the limitations of the historic data. There were other concerns that there were some data in there that weren't substantiated or published, and that the actual people who performed the Delaware Bay egg survey were not consulted, and therefore their expertise was not included. But having said all of that, we came to the conclusion the new rules should not impact the horseshoe crab bait fishery or biomedical use in any way. So we don't have any concerns in that aspect, and we agree that listing the red knot is a positive action which will contribute to the recovery of that bird population and allow for increased funding to study interactions between the horseshoe crabs and the red knot, so it should be considered a positive thing. And the last comment is kind of a little bit of good news. Studies at the University of Delaware have isolated the chemical Q which attracts eels and conch to horseshoe crab. That was done several years ago. Recently, researchers successfully manufactured a workable alternative bait product. It still uses female crab tissues, but very little of it, and they've demonstrated, at least for eels, that the product that they manufacture is effective, and the catch per unit effort for eels was comparable. Delaware Sea Grant published the recipe for this product for fishermen to try. In the fall of 2012, the LaMonica Fine Foods in Millville, New Jersey, scaled up its production to successfully and is field testing with fishermen for horseshoe crabs. So at least we've got a glimmer of hope that there may be an artificial bait product. The question is the cost effectiveness and commercial availability of this alternate bait is still a question. That's it.
Thanks, Penny. Questions for Penny? Pat Augustine?
Yeah, good report, Penny. A question, though, on the increased funding to study the interaction between horseshoe crabs and red knots. It seems as though the bird population, meaning herring and blackback seagulls, never comes up anymore. And in the videos we saw several years ago, and those that have visited that area during the horseshoe crab event, and when the red knots arrived, it shows pictures of the red knots being beat up pretty badly, and food being fought over by the blackback herring and so on. And as I said then, and I'll say it again, in defense of not shutting down the horseshoe crab fishery commercially, several years ago when it was a big to-do and we had to debate about whether we should do it or not, the issue still remained. If you read the 3 reports from the scientists that talked about what happened up in the Great North when they had a collapse of the hatchery where eggs got frozen for several years and that population was diminished. South America, they're being used for target practice and food, I guess, and somewhere else along the line they get beat up before they get up here. It just seems there's a disconnect when you come to the fact that the Staten Island landfills have been closed for several years now, and those birds, generally speaking, have been displaced. And from what I understand, a great number of them are now native to that area down there, very much like Canadian geese. They're no longer Canadian geese, they're American Canadian geese. They're crossovers. But the birds, the herring gulls and blackbacks, never seem to be mentioned in terms of the detrimental effect they have upon red knots and other shorebirds. So how do we get that back on the table? It seems the pressure is always put on the fact that there are not enough horseshoe crab eggs, when in fact when the birds fly away, there are an awful lot of horseshoe crab eggs left there. So how do we deal with that, and how do we keep it on the table and illuminate it as one of the key parts, as opposed to letting the bird people say, don't hurt my birds? So, we want to address it or not, or what can we do about it, other than take some shotguns and go down there and have target practice?
I'll take a stab at it, perhaps. If you look at the listing, you will see an exhaustive treatment of what's known about gulls and their impacts on red knots, what's known about climate change and its impacts, and as well as the bait needs in Delaware Bay and hunting in South America. That's not to say that we have a lot of information about all of those things, but what is known is pretty well detailed in that listing report. Gulls do not seem to be a big impact, at least in the Delaware Bay area. We're not saying that they're not an impact, but they're not a big impact. You'll also, if you look at that listing report or recommended listing package, find that the food supply in Delaware Bay is not being considered a threat under the current management of the Adaptive Resource Management Framework. And what is really driving the listing at this point are factors that are occurring outside Delaware Bay. Primarily, I would argue, climate change, anticipated climate change impacts that are happening in several locations and having various levels of effect with a huge level of uncertainty. But in the foreseeable future, considering how well the global community has done at reducing climate change, it's pretty reasonable, I think, to assume that it's going to get worse and not better. So I don't know if that really addresses your concern, but gulls are certainly on the table. They haven't been forgotten. They just, we're not finding data that says that's a really good smoking gun to point at.
But just to follow up, my dad has a favorite expression. He said, you're either pregnant or can't be a little bit pregnant. You're either a whole lot pregnant or you're not pregnant. In the case of the birds, they're there. They could have been substantial earlier on that had a detrimental effect earlier on. The question is, I hate like heck to see it drop into a crevasse. And I saw that report, and you're right, it is being considered. But how much? That's the question.
Thanks, Babalu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just need to correct the record with regard to states that have enacted bans on the importation of Asian horseshoe crabs. Rhode Island has, in fact, enacted a ban. We enacted it as an emergency regulation early in the summer and just finalized it 2 weeks ago. Thank you.
I next have Stu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Penny, or even Greg, feel free to comment too. In regard to the listing, I noticed that there's a reference to stagnation in the indices in the Delaware Bay area, and there's some what I consider speculative statements about poaching possibly being one of the mechanisms that's keeping that those indices stagnant, if you will. Did the technical committee discuss that at all, or is there any reason to believe that that could be the case? I mean, we have published estimates that estimate the Delaware Bay population at somewhere around 20 million animals, and it seems like poaching on the level that would cause that population to stagnate would have to be
I would suggest that, as at least one member mentioned earlier, poaching is one of those underlying things that have been there all along. This sounds very evasive. We have no reason to believe that it's gotten any worse. You know, we haven't seen it, and the technical committee didn't really discuss it as a increasing problem. But I think it's been a problem from day one.
I'll just add to that a little bit, because those questions have come up in the Delaware Bay Ecosystem Technical Committee fairly often and have had fairly long discussions. The word stagnant I might not use in that regard. It's certainly level and stable. And there's been a lot of concern why the populations have been stable. I was going to get to that a little bit later, but just quickly, the committee has pondered what factors could be driving the population and how long is it reasonable to wait before you would expect to see change.
And there's a number of different factors that have been brought up, such as the length of time it takes the horseshoe crabs to mature, coupled with the very stochastic first-year survival that seems to drive the population in the models we have. But the question of, is there poaching going on that's not detected and not known about? Are there federal water ship-to-ship transfers that nobody knows about that could be having an effect? Is the harm caused by biomedical bleeding greater than we think? And pointing to various pieces of research that some generate a higher estimate than others. And all of those things have been discussed without really getting to any conclusions other than the fact that the population seems to be stable, and that's a good thing. And perhaps it's too long it's been too short of a time to expect. It may be more like a 20-year period before you would see it. Some of the modeling that tries to look at the horseshoe crabs does seem to indicate very stochastic population trends, probably due mostly to that first-year survival issue. And it may be too optimistic to assume that in 10 to 15 years you would see much of a change, especially with the monitoring programs we have, which are very coarse and don't detect trend very well.
Bob, do you want to jump in there? Oh, okay. Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it a little bit ironic that we've talked about other landing places for the red knots, that they don't come where they used to come, but they are somewhere else. And I don't know how much that's been followed when you look at listing the red knot as going downhill. And the fact that we've cut the production or the catching of horseshoe crabs to facilitate more eggs for the red knots, and they still haven't come back, giving me the impression that we've done what we can do. We've done the best we can with providing them with eggs, so it could be something else. And also, in this epic adventure, we also have people that say, well, the horseshoe crab population is going down, and of course I find that a little bit ironic because, of course, we don't know. We don't have a definite idea where they are, and yet we have the horseshoe population increases with eggs, but the birds are eating the eggs, so that could stop more horseshoe crabs from being born, whatever. And my last note, and those were just notes of they were ironic to me, was what did you say the advantage of listing the red knot is, other than somebody gets some money? What's the advantage of listing them at all?
Go ahead, Greg.
Well, I'll take a stab at that one too. And the first thing will be to clarify that the eggs that the birds are eating, the birds are only feeding on the surface eggs. The surface eggs are either eaten by something, a bird or a fish or something else, or else they're drying out and becoming unviable. So I don't think it's reasonable to say that the birds are eating eggs that would become horseshoe crabs. So just an important but minor point perhaps in what you're bringing up. I think the listing package did a really good job of highlighting all the complexity of red knot biology. It raised, by going through that process, there were many areas of stopover found out that people didn't know about before. And it did a really good job of carefully laying out what all the factors are. So I think really the listing follows your concerns in a large part of making sure that it's a balanced approach and looking at what the whole package is that relates to factors that could be affecting red knot populations. The value of the listing is, from my agency standpoint, and maybe our assistant regional director will want to jump in, but the value is because that's our mission.
Our mission is to conserve wildlife, and as an agency, if a species is going down, is becoming rare, we are required to list it. But that also brings better ability to conserve the species as well, because then you have some regulatory abilities that you didn't have if it wasn't listed.
Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just an observation on the issue of the Asian imports. I think, Penny, I heard you say that a state-by-state solution is probably not the best, and I probably would agree with that, that a all-encompassing federal solution might be better. And in fact, there's a bill in both houses of Congress from the New York delegation in committee. I don't think I need to make any comment on the functionality of the U.S. Congress these days, so that solution is probably not going to be forthcoming anytime soon. I don't need to tell anybody around this table the potential time bomb that these Asian imports could represent in terms of a pathogen or parasites and what that could do to this whole domestic horseshoe crab issue. We need to take that very seriously. It also has a secondary effect that the Asian populations most of them are in really bad shape. But those economies over there see a potential some money to be made by shipping their animals over here, and the laws over there for protecting their populations aren't quite so hotly prosecuted, so animals are coming in. So, and all that said, I would urge each state that has not already taken action to consider your options and strongly move in that direction. Don't wait for a federal solution anytime soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to take two more comments, Roy Miller and then Bob Beal, and then we're going to move on because I've blown through my 15 extra minutes, and we have an final action item to come up. So, Roy?
I was just going to briefly point out the technical committee has informed us that the proposed listing is likely not to have a deleterious impact on the present harvest scenarios of horseshoe crabs, but a proposed listing could have both potentially beneficial and potentially negative consequences for other projects that we're all interested in that impact horseshoe crab habitat, spawning habitat, such as beach nourishment projects and sand bypasses and augmentation and that kind of thing. Just pointing that out, that there's a variety of potential impacts from a listing other than just impacts directly to harvest of horseshoe crabs. Thanks.
Good point, Roy, and we're living those right now in New York and New Jersey with all the beaches we're restoring. So, go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just following up on Mike Millard's comments on the Asian horseshoe crab importation. I guess the question is, are these events still going on? I know historically there was two importations, both went into New York, and those were kind of the ones that got this whole issue, brought it to everyone's mind. And are folks aware are there still importation events going on with these animals?
The TC discussed it, and they're speculating that yes, and they just don't know about it into states surrounding New York, but there aren't any identified.
Okay. I think, again, following up on Mike's comments, there was some initiative a while back about a year ago, I guess, to include Lacey Act provisions and those sorts of things for horseshoe crabs, but they're technically not fish or fin fish, so they didn't fall under under the Lacey Act. So you could get spiders included, then you could get horseshoe crabs. So it was this big convoluted thing, and it never got anywhere. But if there's, if there is some initiative and some movement on Capitol Hill, we might be able to chime in on that and suggest those bills, are de-mothballed and actually come to the forefront, maybe get some consideration.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, those bills, that is the bill in Congress that expands the tax included under the Lacey Act. But again, it's stalled and has been for a bit. But
okay, so before we move on, there was a suggestion in the report that we write a letter. Hey, we're going to get you the iPad app, the letter writing app, I think. So is that the pleasure of the board to do a letter? I see heads nodding, so Marin, if you can add that to your list of activities. Okay, moving on. The Delaware Bay Ecosystem Technical Committee report. We have the chair of that, Greg Breeze, is going to do a presentation on that.
Thank you. I'm going to cover three broad topics. One will be the ARM-based harvest recommendations. The other will be what we've learned from updating the various surveys that we look at on horseshoe crabs and shorebirds. And the final will be a report out from the working group that looked at the egg survey, a question that had been raised by Delaware. I'll get to that in a moment. There will be time for questions, but if you do have a clarifying question about a point I'm making, feel free to interrupt. The harvest recommendations, if you'll recall, are based on population models, and they have thresholds or constraints in them so that harvest is valued, but if the bird population is not high, then it's not valued as highly and could potentially go down to zero value. And so those population models are run out to essentially infinity and looked at to make sure that the populations are doing what we want them to do. And then a big lookup table essentially is created so that each year you can look at the horseshoe crab population and the red knot population and come up with the recommended harvest allocations. And for this year, it is the same as it was last year. And I'll go over that in a little more detail. So the horseshoe crab abundance data is from the Virginia Tech 2012 survey. Now that survey was not fully funded, which is a problem that I'll get to in another minute. Since it had only partial funding, the ARM work group had to extrapolate based on the ratio of what the reduced survey showed compared to previous years where the full survey was shown. And when they did that, they came up with a mature male estimate of a little over 18.5 million, mature female estimate of a little over 7 million. And if you added those two numbers together quickly in your head, you came up with about 25.9 million. The red knot abundance is from a new technique or new methodology that we started using 3 years ago. The idea was to move from the peak count, which nobody had a great deal of faith in, and go to a marked, unmarked methodology, which accounts for the turnover, which is a big deal when you're talking about migratory birds where some are coming, some are staying, and some are leaving over the season. So the new estimate of the population was 48,955 based on that new methodology. And down below in the grayed out, you can see what the peak count would have been. So you can see it's a lot higher than what the peak count would be. And if you'll recall, in the ARM model, there's a threshold that the birds have to meet. So we needed to also, the ARM working group also had to change that threshold to be consistent with the new understanding of what the total population and the stopover would be. And so the new number is 81,900. Which is based on the old threshold and looking at how the marked, unmarked counts compare to the peak counts, if that makes sense. And the old threshold you can see in the grayed out words below. So let me go back to the monitoring issue and just say that the TC and the ARM working group really appreciates the fact that this group did an awful lot to try to keep that Virginia Tech trawl survey going. That was really important, and you guys really busted your humps trying to do that. Unfortunately, the funding did dry up, and so it will not be conducted in this fall, and it will not be conducted in future years as far as we know, which potentially would make it impossible to use the adaptive resource management framework. However, NEMAP appears to be a really good alternative, and the ARM working group is working to make that happen. So, if you'll recall, there were 5 harvest packages that the framework could recommend, that the ARM could recommend, and it's recommending, as it did last year, package number 3, which is a male-only harvest for the Delaware Bay region at 500,000 crabs. And as worked through the spreadsheet that takes into account the how to allocate it between the different states. That comes out to 162,000 plus change for Delaware and New Jersey. All of Delaware and New Jersey's harvest is believed to be Delaware Bay origin crabs. And then for Maryland and Virginia, which have a portion of their harvest Delaware Bay origin and a portion that is not, you can see both their Delaware Bay origin allocation plus their total quota after that. And with that, do you have any questions or discussion on the harvest recommendations?
Questions for Greg? Okay, this is a final action, so I'm going to need a motion, and we're going to need possibly a roll call vote. So does someone have a motion they would like to offer? The ever-dependable Mr. Augustine.
So is someone going to type one up for me, or do I have to wing it? Tony or Kate, one of you going to type me up one? Okay. And just one point. Greg, could you give us an idea how much that survey cost, that Virginia survey, that VTech survey?
I've been informed that it's about 200,000.
Well, I'll throw 2 cents in here. If essentially we're going to be transferring over to relying on NEMAP, that's just another reason why we really have to focus in on NEMAP funding and make sure we're all helping that cause along, since it's getting more and more important.
Pretty straightforward, Mr. Chairman. Move to accept the 2014 ARM recommendations that's presented today.
Do I have a second? Roy Miller. Any discussion on the motion? Is there any objection to the motion or any abstentions? Seeing none, we will dispense with the roll call vote, and we will accept this as unanimously approved. Thanks. All right, the next topic is the shorebird and horseshoe crab survey report summary. And Greg's going to do
Yes, yes. So now we'll move over to what we know about the updates to the surveys. The surveys were, continued year to year, so we have a little bit of information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Penny already went over a lot of what the horseshoe crab surveys were showing. But we'll talk about the trawl surveys, the spawning surveys, and the egg survey. Actually, I'll discuss more later. The trawl surveys, as Penny said, in the Delaware Bay region don't seem to be showing any trend. Some surveys show a little increase, some show a little decrease. We seem to have some confidence that the population has been stable for a number of years. There is a lot of high variability among the surveys, a lot of 0 points, so they're difficult to discern trends from. The spawning surveys, there's actually 2 now. Maryland Coastal Bays has been doing a spawning survey, but it hasn't stayed with consistent methodology for long enough to evaluate any trends. With the Delaware Bay spawning survey, which you're all pretty familiar with, it's continuing to show no trend in male or female spawning density. And they added, at the request of the committee, sex ratios to track that and see if male-only harvest is having any effect. And you can look and see at that second bullet that there doesn't seem to be any effect, as far as we can tell, on the male-only harvest. We were disappointed that we didn't have shorebird information in a timely fashion, and so as the chair, I'm going to take the initiative to write a letter requesting that we get information for the latest surveys, and we get information in a timely fashion in future years. But we did have some anecdotal information, and the anecdotal information did suggest that the bird population was about the same as it had been last year during the stopover, with the interesting note that the birds stayed primarily on the Jersey side, which suggests they didn't need to move across the bay to get food, which suggests that the food supply was not a limiting factor for the birds. So that's a positive in my mind. And due to, as Stu brought up, it's been a while that the birds and the crabs have been stable, so what's going on? So although we haven't seen any change, it has been stable. We recognize that the surveys are not very good at detecting change, especially the type of small change we'd like to see to know that we're having success. So a number of factors were looked at. These were the three that, in my mind, rose to the top. First-year survivorship of young horseshoe crabs seems to be a real issue or factor driving what the population is going to do. But the question has also been raised, we're starting to see some effects from climate change in the Delaware Bay region. We've had researchers reporting that, for instance, blue mussels range has retracted up to the north. And where it used to be down to the tip of Virginia, now it's ending around Delaware. So we're seeing some effects, and you can't help but wonder, we're not doing a lot of work on how well the ecosystem is serving horseshoe crabs. How well is their food supply maintaining? And what is the water temperature changes and acidification changes could be having an effect on them? And then what keeps being brought up is, are we absolutely positive that there's no other losses, there's no poaching, and although nobody seems to be able to find anything that we're missing, the question still comes up each time in the committee. But as I said before when I answered Stu's question, modeling does suggest this is going to take a while, and it may take more like 20 years rather than 10 years, which I think everybody was hoping for at one point in time. So are there any questions on the survey updates that I presented?
Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the Delaware Bay Egg Survey Review Report.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll move to the egg survey. And so the question was posed by Delaware in this winter, I believe, saying we're being mandated to have this survey, and it's a pretty expensive survey. Could you tell us if it's really something that's useful to you? And a very reasonable question in my mind. If you'll recall, in Addendum 3 was when it was made mandatory for Delaware and New Jersey. So we appointed a working group with a goal to determine if the survey has utility and should be mandated. Just as a little bit of background, it's been going on for quite a few years. During that time, New Jersey results have always been lower than Delaware results, which has raised a lot of questions and uncertainty about how much to trust the survey. There were two attempts, one in 2008, one in 2011-12, to see if we could figure out why the results seemed to be different, with not any real strong success, just raising a number of questions and issues to be considered. The data has been useful to look at, but it hasn't really been used in decision making in any direct way. So the working group was set up. They had several, two I believe, lengthy conference calls to address this issue and figure out what recommendations to provide. And the conclusion was that that it is not being used directly for management decisions. The ARM doesn't need it, and in fact relies on more direct measures of what we value, which is how many birds and how many crabs are out there. There are methodological issues that are causing a problem, reducing confidence in the survey. And the recognition that surface eggs are a very ephemeral resource. One gentleman pointed out today that birds are eating the eggs. So are you really measuring something that is telling you what you think it's telling you, and how well can you detect a trend? We did do some actual estimations of what the power of the survey would be, and got something on the order of 75% probability of a 50% change in density of eggs over a 5-year period. So a pretty low ability to detect any trends, especially the type of trend that the amount of trend difference that we would like to see. Sorry. Thank you. So the working group recommended, and the technical committee concurs, that it should not be continued as a compliance element, that we can discontinue it as a compliance element of the fishery management plan. However, the working group also wanted to point out that that they're willing to help improve the survey if the states would like to do that, and that they can see reasons why individual states may well want to continue the survey. A good example is New Jersey, which has it as a state-mandated survey. So they're not trying to say that it should be stopped, but it shouldn't be a compliance element. Are there any questions?
Go ahead, Stu.
Greg, I just wanted to thank you and the committee and Marin for taking on this issue. I was on at least one of those calls and know it was difficult. I really appreciate your work, but I think if it's appropriate, I'd like to ask that the board formally approve that this compliance measure be removed from the requirements of Addendum 3 to the plan.
You're putting that up as a motion.
Yes, I'd like to.
Okay, while we get that up, so I have a second from Pat Augustine.
Move that, I've got some wording, you want it? Okay, move that the egg survey monitoring requirement applicable to the states of Delaware and New Jersey be excluded as a monitoring requirement.
Okay, before we take some discussion on this, let me just clarify. I checked with the executive director, and I believe since it's a technical recommendation, we could vote on this and remove it from as a requirement, but then to formalize it the next time an addendum's done is that we would add this in to formally amend the FMP. So with that understanding, let's go with some discussion. I have Richie White. Oh, nope. Okay. Any other questions on this?
Just effective date, Mr. Chairman. Immediately?
Yes, the board should clarify for Delaware when this will be removed as a compliance element, since it won't be in its own addenda.
Stu, you want to add an action date?
Yeah, how about for the 2014 spawning season and beyond?
Is everybody comfortable with the 2014 spawning season? Okay. Is there any discussion on the motion, Mr. O'Connell?
I think what I heard from counterpart in Delaware is that perhaps it would be for beginning with the 2014 spawning season. You didn't want it just for 14, correct?
Good clarification. Any other questions or discussion on the motion? Is there any objection? Okay. I know, Joe. Thank you very much. Let me read the motion. Move that the egg survey monitoring requirement for the states of Delaware and New Jersey be excluded as a compliance requirement beginning with the 2014 spawning season. Motion by Mr. Michaels and seconded by Mr. Augustine. Is there any objection to the motion? Any abstentions? No. Seeing none, we will accept this as unanimously approved, and we're done with that one. We're down to our final agenda item, which is other business. I didn't get anything before. Has anything come up? Adam Nowalski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Pete Himchak. This is his last board meeting. He's moving on to a non-fisheries related life. I have reserved the domain name peterhimchakconsulting.com for him should he change his mind. I want to thank him both as a fisherman for his years of service to New Jersey, as well as on a personal note as a mentor to me here, and I thank him very much for his service. Thank you, Pete.
Pete, do you have any parting words? And just to correct Adam's thing, he's going to the Caribbean to go explore tropical fish in a couple of weeks, so I'm
Yeah.
not really feeling that bad for him.
I'm going on to diving in the Caribbean, so it's and then the sky's the limit. But yeah, I appreciate the round of applause, and I just always, my philosophy is, like you come in quiet and you go out quiet, and it's how you treat people while you're here that matters, and that's what you remember. So, I mean, I'm not going in the cave to hibernate or anything, but I'll be around.
Well, congratulations, Pete, and we hope to see you. You're welcome back anytime for your wisdom and your long-term service, so thanks again. With that, I see no other additional business, so I just need a motion to adjourn. Okay, so moved, and we are adjourned. Mr.